Put down the glass. The floor manager's voice cut through the soft clink of silverware and the string quartet humming near the window. Every head in Stanton's turned. The woman seated at table 9 was 72 years old, small-boned, silver-haired. She wore a pale blue cardigan with a pearl button at the collar, and she had been sitting alone with a glass of Bordeaux and a plate of roasted salmon, reading a hardcover book with the careful attention of someone who had learned to enjoy her own company. She looked up now at the floor manager standing over her, and her confusion was so complete and so genuine that it would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Ruby Sinclair was paying attention. She always paid attention. It was, in her private estimation, the only talent she had developed. Without trying, she sat at a corner table. The kind corner tables were made for small, partially obscured by a pillar, easy to overlook. She had ordered the soup and the bread, and a sparkling water, which was already stretching a lunch budget she had promised herself she wouldn't blow. She had been celebrating, quietly, alone, because her one-woman bookkeeping firm had just landed its first real corporate inquiry, and she was the reason it had happened. Nobody else knew. Nobody else needed to. But now she was watching the woman at table 9, and the soup was going cold. That bottle was ordered for table 12. The floor manager, whose name tag read Cassidy, held a white order ticket between 2 fingers the way someone holds a cigarette. Precise, dismissive. You've consumed wine that does not belong to your tap. I'm sorry, the older woman said. I don't understand. The young man brought it to me. He made an error. That doesn't make it yours to drink. I didn't ask for it. He brought it. And now it's nearly empty. 2 servers had materialized at the edges of the table, not close enough to look aggressive, but close enough to prevent the woman from simply standing and walking away. A guest 3 tables over had her phone out. Another had turned his chair. Ruby set down her spoon. The order ticket Cassidy was holding had a large black 12 printed in the upper corner. Ruby knew this because Ruby worked with numbers the way other people worked with language, automatically, involuntarily, her eye drawn to figures before anything else. She had read that ticket number from 14 feet away, the moment Cassidy produced it. Table 12, not table 9. Excuse me, Ruby said. No one heard her the first time. She was not the kind of person rooms heard automatically. She understood this about herself with the flat, unsentimental clarity of someone who had spent years calculating the distance between who she was and who a room expected. She was aware of how much space she occupied, the width of her shoulders, the fullness of her hips. The way her blazer pulled slightly at the buttons when she stood. She was aware, and she stood up anyway, because the woman at table 9 was trembling, and her hands had gone white around the edge of the tablecloth, and nobody else had moved. Excuse me, she said again louder. Cassidy turned. Her expression did the thing that certain faces do, a quick, involuntary recalibration. Taking Ruby in, deciding, in the time it takes to blink, exactly how much attention to pay. This is a private matter. That's a table 12 ticket. Ruby pointed, not rudely, just directly. The number is printed right there in the corner. Table 9 didn't order that wine. Your server brought it to the wrong table. Cassidy's chin lifted. I'm sorry. The Bordeaux. It's on a table 12 order. This woman didn't ask for it. She didn't move it. It was placed here by your staff. Ruby kept her voice even. Not angry. Precise. If you'd like to verify, you can pull the server's ticket book for this section. His name will be on the stub. The dining room had gone quiet enough to hear the string quartet filtering in from the next room. Cassidy produced a smile that wasn't one. Our internal processes. Ma'am. Ruby looked past her toward an older man in a dark vest who had appeared at the edge of the room. The restaurant manager. I'm a bookkeeper. Numbers are what I do. That ticket says 12. This is table 9. That's not a judgment call. It's arithmetic. The manager crossed the room. He took the ticket from Cassidy's hand. He looked at it. He looked at Cassidy. The color left her face in a way that was almost clinical to observe. What followed was quiet and efficient. The server was called over, a 20-year-old on his third week of work, who confirmed, miserably, that yes, he had placed the bottle at the wrong table. The table 12 guests had already been comped a replacement bottle 20 minutes ago, having flagged the error through a different server, information that Cassidy, somehow, had not possessed before deciding to publicly detain a 72-year-old woman over wine she hadn't ordered. The older woman sat through all of it with the stillness of someone who has outlived a great deal of chaos and understood that if you didn't feed it, it eventually ran out of fuel. When it was over, when Cassidy had been taken to the back of the house and the manager had apologized with the wooden sincerity of someone calculating liability, Ruby went back to her table and found her soup cold and her bread stiff, and found she didn't mind. You didn't have to do that. She looked up. The older woman stood at the edge of her table. Up close, her eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they were sharper than Ruby had expected. Anyone would have, Ruby said. They didn't, the woman replied. Ruby had no answer for that. She gestured at the chair across from her. The woman sat down with the careful economy of someone who had learned which movements cost energy and which ones didn't. You noticed the ticket number, she said. Occupational habit. What do you do? Bookkeeping, small businesses mostly, caterers, event planners, a few restaurant groups. Ruby smiled a little, less exciting than it sounds. The woman looked at her for a moment, with an expression Ruby couldn't entirely read. I'm Lydia, she said. Lydia Sheridan. Ruby Sinclair. They sat together for the remainder of lunch. Ruby ordered a second sparkling water, and Lydia ordered tea, and they talked about the neighborhood and the weather, and a bakery 3 blocks east that Lydia claimed made an acceptable croissant. Ruby walked her to the door afterward, because the afternoon had turned gray, and it seemed like the right thing to do. And she didn't think about it again for 3 days. She didn't think about it again for 3 days. The Sheridan estate in Beacon Hill didn't look like what it was. This was intentional. Federal period brick, tasteful and unremarkable. The kind of house that belonged to an old family with old money and a deep preference for not being looked at. Inside it was different. Not extravagant, but ordered, controlled. The environment of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that everything around him would reflect exactly the level of precision he brought to everything else. Cade Sheridan loosened his tie at 9:15 on a Tuesday evening and asked his mother how her lunch had been. He asked because she had been quiet at dinner in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Lydia Sheridan used silence deliberately, the way other people used words. Tonight her silence had a texture to it. Fine, she said. He waited. She set down her tea. There was a small incident at Stanton's. He kept his expression neutral. This was not difficult. Cade Sheridan had been keeping his expressions neutral since he was 19 years old, when he had first understood what it would cost him to hold what his father had built. He was 41 now. Neutral was not a performance. It was a resting state. What kind of incident? She told him. All of it. The wine, the ticket, the servers closing in, Cassidy, the room full of people with their phones raised. She told it the way she told most things, without drama, in the order it happened. When she finished, she mentioned the young woman who had stood up. She was sitting alone, Lydia said, eating by herself in a corner. She didn't have to say anything. Everyone else was watching. But she did. She read the ticket number from across the room and corrected the floor manager in front of the entire dining room. A pause. Calmly, Cade said, "Show me your wrists." Lydia looked at him. You've been holding your left arm against your side since dinner." She exhaled and turned her arm over. The bruise wasn't severe, a pale pressure mark where a server had gripped her before the situation was resolved. But it was there, finger-shaped, fresh. The room became very still. Kay did not raise his voice. Men who needed volume to convey danger were advertising a weakness. He set his glass down on the side table. A sound barely audible, just a soft click of crystal on wood, and the two men stationed at the far end of the hall straightened instinctively, the way an animal responds to a drop in pressure before a storm. "Her name," he said. "The young woman who helped me, Ruby Sinclair. She said she does bookkeeping. The manager who let it reach that point. I didn't ask. I'll find him," he stood, "and the one who started it. Cade." Lydia's voice was quiet but exact. The young woman, she knew nothing. She was simply kind. "Whatever you do, you leave her alone." He looked at his mother for a moment. "I mean it," she said. He said nothing, which, with him, was as close to a promise as anyone ever received. By morning, he had the footage. Not from Stanton's system, their server was locked, but from a street camera on the corner of the block, supplemented by cell phone video that two separate diners had uploaded and then deleted poorly, leaving recoverable traces. His head of security had the compiled file to Cade's tablet by 6 a.m. He watched it twice without speaking. He watched Cassidy approach the table, watched the servers close in, watched his mother's hands go white on the tablecloth, watched the phones rise throughout the room. Then he watched Ruby Sinclair stand up. She did it the way someone does something they decided before they finished thinking. Chair back, on her feet, crossing the room without pausing to check if anyone was watching. She wasn't small, and she didn't move like someone trying to minimize herself. She moved like someone with a destination. He paused the footage on the moment. She pointed at the ticket. He had spent 20 years reading people. Clients, rivals, men who thought they were concealing something, and men who knew they were caught. He had learned to measure courage by what it costs, not by what it produces. This woman had stood up in a room full of people who hadn't. She had contradicted a manager twice her professional authority, in public, over a dispute that was entirely none of her business. She had done it with arithmetic and without theatre, and when it was done, she had gone back to her corner table and finished her lunch. He restarted the footage, watched her walk Lydia to the door. "The bookkeeping firm," he said. His assistant appeared in the doorway. "Sinclair Bookkeeping and Accounting, sole proprietor, trying to build a corporate client list. Current accounts are small, 2 restaurant groups, a catering company. Send her a client inquiry from the Meridian Group." He set the tablet down, the legitimate side. He added one more instruction, and his voice remained perfectly level as he gave it, the same tone he used to confirm a meeting time. No surveillance that makes her uncomfortable, no contact she hasn't invited. If she ever seems uneasy, we step back. The men in the room exchanged a brief look. It was an unusual instruction, very unusual. Most people sought Cade Sheridan's attention. This one had earned his respect before she had any idea his name existed. The Meridian Group inquiry arrived in Ruby's inbox on a Wednesday, and she stared at it for 40 minutes before answering. The contract offered quarterly reconciliation on 3 accounts. Clean, legitimate, the kind of work that required real skill. The retainer was more than she had made in the previous 4 months combined. She nearly wrote back to ask if someone had made an error. Instead, she triple-checked every line item, because that was what she did, and then she accepted. The first meeting was in a glass-walled conference room, in a building downtown that Ruby had walked past 100 times. She brought a yellow legal pad and 2 sharpened pencils. She trusted analog backups. The man who walked in to meet her wore a charcoal suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and moved through the room the way certain men move. Like the room had already agreed to accommodate him before he arrived. "Mr. Sheridan," the assistant said, and left. "Mrs. Sinclair." He sat across from her. "Thank you for coming." "Your expense categorization for Q3 is wrong," she said. He stopped. "Not fraud wrong," she clarified. "Whoever built this chart of accounts hasn't updated the depreciation schedule since 2019. It's costing you roughly $11,000 a year in overstated losses." She turned the legal pad toward him. "I marked the line items." He looked at the pad, then at her. "You've been reviewing our files for 3 days," he said. "You sent me 3 years of statements," she clicked her pencil. "I read fast." Something shifted in his expression. Small, controlled, but visible to someone paying close attention. Ruby was paying close attention. "Fix it," he said. "That's why you hired me." She pulled the pad back. "Your vendor contracts in the hospitality column also don't match the payment timestamps. That might be intentional, so I'll flag it and wait before I touch anything." The meeting lasted 90 minutes. He asked 3 questions. All 3 were better than most clients asked in a year. When it was over, he shook her hand, and Ruby left with the peculiar sensation of having said all the right things, without fully understanding why they mattered. She mentioned none of this to Lydia, except that Lydia had already started coming by the office. She appeared 2 weeks after the Meridian meeting with coffee and a claim that she was in the neighborhood. She returned the following week with banana bread from the bakery 3 blocks east. Ruby's assistant, a 23-year-old named Deb, who noticed everything and said little, watched this pattern develop with the expression of someone quietly completing a puzzle. "Your new client," Lydia said one afternoon without looking up from her coffee. "How is he?" Ruby set down her cup. "You know him." Lydia's expression remained entirely, impressively, neutral. "Lydia, he values his privacy. He's my client. And an excellent one, I hope. Is he your son?" The pause answered for her. Ruby sat with this for a moment. "Does he know you've been coming here?" "He knows." A small, careful smile. "He has people who tell him things." "And he didn't tell you to stop." "He didn't." Lydia folded her hands around her cup. "He isn't the sort of person who does things without reasons, Ruby." Ruby thought about the conference room, the questions he'd asked, the way he had looked at her marked-up legal pad. Not as a curiosity, but as something that made sense to him. "He's interesting," she said finally, which was not what she had meant to say. Lydia's expression was the expression of a woman who had been quietly working toward exactly that response for several weeks. The Meridian Group sponsored a formal dinner in November, a fundraiser for the Greater Boston Food Security Initiative, held in the ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel. Lydia mentioned it in October. Ruby said no. She mentioned it again. Ruby said no again. By the 4th mention, Ruby had run out of objections that held up under examination, and she had a burgundy dress in the back of her closet that she had bought 2 years ago and lost her nerve over before every occasion since. She wore it. She arrived and stood near the entrance longer than she meant to, doing the geometry of the room, table arrangements, sight lines, the way crowds cluster and where the quiet pockets form. It was habit. She had always been better at calculating the geometry of spaces than at deciding she belonged in them. "You look like you're planning an emergency exit." She turned. Cade Sheridan stood 2 feet away in a black tuxedo, watching her with the same particular attention he'd brought to her legal pad in the conference room. "I do that in new rooms," she said. "Does it help?" "Usually." She glanced across the ballroom. "The foundation work you do, the community kitchen grants specifically. I looked into them. The distribution model is sound." "You looked us up. You're my client." That's not the only reason you looked. She met his eyes. No, she said, it isn't. They stood in the specific silence of two people who have said more than they intended and are deciding whether to pretend otherwise. Then Cassidy Moore came through the door. Ruby saw her half a second before Cassidy saw her, which was enough time to know that the recognition was going to be mutual and that nothing easy was coming next. Cassidy had landed a position at the Whitmore after her demotion at Stanton's. Hospitality was a small industry. References traveled selectively, and the full account of what had happened in that dining room hadn't circulated as far as it deserved. She crossed toward Ruby, with the directness of someone who had been waiting for this particular room. Ruby Sinclair. Her voice was pleasant and precisely calibrated. I didn't expect you here. I was invited, Ruby said. Of course you were. Cassidy smiled at the nearby guests, including them. I'm sure you made yourself useful somehow. That's what women like you do. Find the right rooms. Make yourselves just useful enough to stay. Several guests had turned. Ruby breathed in slowly. She thought about every room she had stood in the corner of, every chair she had pulled to the edge, every table she had chosen for its pillar cover and its proximity to the exit. She thought about a woman at table 9 who had been trembling and a room full of people who had lifted their phones instead of their voices. She thought, not this time. Women like me, Ruby said steadily, stand up when other people sit down. That is what I did at Stanton's. That is why a ticket number got examined, and a mistake got corrected, and you are at this hotel instead of that one. She kept her voice even. No anger, just fact. I'd let that be the end of it if I were you. Cassidy's smile went rigid. She reached forward and closed her fingers around Ruby's wrist. Cade Sheridan's hand was there in the same breath. Not grabbing, not dramatic. Simply present. His fingers closed around Cassidy's wrist with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his adult life needed volume to communicate something important. Cassidy went completely still. He didn't look at her first. He looked at Ruby, a quick, careful check, and then he turned to Cassidy, and the expression on his face was the clearest thing Ruby thought she had ever seen on a human being. Complete, absolute, entirely quiet. Let go, he said. She let go. The ballroom held its breath. Cade turned to face the room, not performing. Just addressing it, the way a man addresses a room when he has decided something needs to be said and understands without ego that rooms listen to him. The woman who was just threatened, he said, is the reason my mother came home from a restaurant last month instead of something worse. She was sitting alone in a dining room full of people who watched and recorded, and she was the only one who stood up. She didn't know my mother's name. She didn't ask. She saw someone being treated wrongly, and he voiced what she knew to correct. His voice remained even throughout, unhurried. I've spent a long time in rooms full of people performing usefulness. That woman walked across a room for a stranger. There is no comparison. No one spoke. Cassidy was already edging sideways through the crowd in the quiet, sideways way of someone becoming invisible by degrees. Nobody moved to help her. Cade turned back to Ruby. He offered his arm, not as a rescue, as an invitation. I believe we were about to get a drink, he said. Ruby looked at him. She had spent most of her adult life in corners, near pillars, at edge tables, calculating whether the exposure was worth the outcome before she opened her mouth. She was still running the calculation. She ran it fast. She put her hand in the crook of his arm and they walked to the bar, and the room rearranged itself around them without anyone seeming to decide to do it. He told her everything in December on a bench in the public garden that was too cold for anyone else to want it. He told her about his father and the organization, and what Cade had decided to do with it when it became his. The lines he had drawn, the ones he had held, the ones that existed because the alternative was something considerably worse. He didn't excuse it or perform regret, he said. This is what is true, and I wanted you to know it from me before someone else decided you should. Ruby held her coffee cup in both hands and listened until he was done. The Meridian accounts, she said. Fully separated, clean. I know they are, I checked. She looked at him. I want to be sure you understand you kept me on because I'm good at this. Not for another reason. You're exceptional at it, he said. That's one of the reasons. The park was quiet around them. A bird moved through bare branches overhead. I'm not what people expect, Ruby said. Not apology, inventory, just naming it. Standing next to you in photographs. At events, people will have things to say. People always have things to say. He watched her. I've found over the years that it says nothing useful about either party. She looked down at her coffee. The night at Stanton's, you saw the footage. Yes. So you know it wasn't anything heroic. I noticed a number. That's all I did. You noticed a number, he said, and then you stood up in a room full of people who hadn't, and corrected someone with twice your apparent authority on behalf of a woman whose name you didn't know. He paused. I have spent 20 years in rooms where everyone is afraid of me or wants something from me. You sat across a conference table 3 days after meeting me and told me my depreciation schedule was wrong. Something shifted in his expression. Careful, unhurried, but real. I find I am not willing to let you disappear back into that corner table. Ruby was quiet for a long time. The cold settled around them, clear and simple. Your mother has been engineering this since the first week, she said finally. She has. She's very good at it. She's had decades of practice. A pause. She told me the day she met you that you had a beautiful mind and terrible shoes. Ruby almost laughed. The shoes are practical. She also said you were the first person in years who had made her feel ordinary. She meant it as the highest compliment she knew how to give. Ruby looked at him for a long moment. At the steadiness of him. At the fact that he was sitting on a cold bench in December, telling her the truth when he could have told her anything. I need time, she said. I have time. I'm still your bookkeeper. You're very good at it. I'm going to keep telling you when the numbers are wrong. I expect nothing less. She turned back toward the path. Buy me another coffee, she said, and tell me how the hospitality column discrepancy resolves, because it has been bothering me for 6 weeks. He stood. The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. They walked. The following spring, Ruby Sinclair's firm took on 4 new clients and hired 2 full-time staff. She moved to a larger office 2 floors up in the same building, with windows that faced east and got clean light in the mornings. She bought a coffee maker that didn't come from a drugstore clearance rack. She stopped sitting near pillars. At a Sheridan family dinner in April, Lydia was asked when she had known. She didn't hesitate. She turned toward Ruby with the same quiet certainty she had worn the afternoon they had sat together over cold soup and cooling tea. The moment she pointed to that ticket number, Lydia said. She wasn't doing it to be noticed. She wasn't doing it to be thanked. She did it because the number was wrong and someone was being hurt, and she was the only one in the room who had decided that mattered enough to stand up for. The table was still. Cade took Ruby's hand under the table, their fingers settling together without ceremony. Ruby had spent a long time learning to make herself smaller, in dining rooms, in conference rooms, in every space where she had calculated in advance whether she was too much. She still noticed the geometry of rooms. She probably always would. But she had stopped shrinking inside it. And in the small, bright office with its east-facing windows, the ledgers balanced, the numbers added up cleanly, and Ruby Sinclair occupied exactly as much space as she needed, which, it turned out, had always been considerable.